I'd like to introduce my co-facilitator today. Jabe Bloom is a dear friend, and he works at Red Hat in the Global Transformation Office. And he's the one that taught me about this wonderful thing called Anticipatory Awareness. And I'm extremely excited for him to share his thoughts and time with you today.
Thanks, Ben.
Disclaimer. Look, we're going to be talking about some things today that a lot of people are probably feeling anxious about. And so I want to acknowledge our humanity in this moment. It's okay to be human. It's okay to be afraid, scared, sad, but even joyful, inspired, hopeful. All of that is okay. It's okay to be human, but don't forget to be kind to each other. Today, we're going to have kind of three major sections. We're going to talk about what it means to anticipate reality. We're going to do some story writing, and then we're going to do some storytelling. And whatever time we have left, and for the after hours, we'll kind of have an open discussion about things. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to you, Jade.
All right. So we're going to talk today about what's called anticipatory awareness. Anticipatory awareness is a concept it's different than prediction and it's different than futuring, both of which are different ideas about how you might address the future. And anticipatory awareness is really about kind of merging humans' abilities for storytelling and imagining things with our ability to plan things. And one of the really key ideas to get out of this, just right off the start, is that if you're working with anticipatory awareness, what you're doing is trying to assemble a set of triggers. So like, what should I be watching for in the environment so that I know that I need to kind of activate a story that I've already thought through a little bit. One of the ways to think about this is that in your personal life as an individual or as an organization that you might be working in, you have a limited amount of attention to spend. And so in a lot of organizations, they spend a lot of their attention on a very narrow set of options or trying to drive towards a specific outcome. And this comes at the cost of not scanning the environment for weak signals that could indicate that the primary focus of the organization is moving in the wrong direction now. So normally these things occur in ways in which, like, you might lose some market advantage because you didn't notice something that was important that was happening, and then someone else took advantage of it. In other times, when there's kind of crises, global crises, this management of your attention becomes critical for just making or navigating through the crisis itself. So not getting kind of jammed or stuck. So I call this idea following Donna Haraway. She's got a lovely book that's called Staying with the Trouble. You guys should all pick it up. It's great. And what she basically says is that one of the biggest problems we have as humans is staying engaged in the problem. So we like to think that we can create a solution, and that solution will kind of neatly package up the problem in a way that we don't have to worry so much anymore. And so we can leave the trouble behind and go off and do other things. And then there's this other skill that we really need to develop, which is kind of staying with the trouble, staying engaged with the problem itself. And of course, when the problem includes things like global pandemics, that is kind of a psychologically difficult or traumatic experience to be having, right? So like staying with several 100,000 to 1 million people dying as a problem causes us to be fearful, causes lots of problems. But this same idea of not being able to stay with the trouble impacts us in other ways. And it is a common cause of the loss of resilience inside of an organization. So what I mean by the loss of resilience inside of an organization is that organizations are resilient when they can respond to change, when they can kind of fluidly move towards new optima as the system dynamics are changing. And when they can't do that, they are losing their resilient capacity. And this is often caused by basically getting locked into mind frames, stories, narratives, any way you want to describe this way of imagining the world, and not being able to change them, even though the world itself is changing. So you have some way of imagining the world, and it works the right way, and then some event happens, and the way that you imagine the world and the way the world actually is don't align anymore, and you get stuck in the original frame, and you make things worse instead of making things better. Yeah? So there's three theoretical ways inside of at least resilience engineering that cause this kind of stickiness of previous mindsets and kind of make it so that it's hard to change what we're thinking about, right? And the first one is that people tend to explain away anomalies. The small, weak signals that would become problems eventually get explained away as basically, hey, we've done this before, we've done this a lot of times, or yeah, I've noticed that one little thing happens every once in a while, but it happens every once in a while and it never caused a problem in the past. So we'll just ignore it for right now. And the idea of this in complexity theory is that kind of initial conditions and small initial conditions cause significant changes in complex systems. And so actually kind of suppressing the noticing of these small weak signals is ignoring potential large outcomes in the future, right? So it's the relationship between ignoring weak signals and the fact that in a complex system, weak signals can cause significant change in the future that is kind of problematic in this case, right? And so there's all sorts of stories in aviation about this, and it's usually that it's not a small fault that causes a big catastrophe. It is the combination of multiple small faults that, as one-offs, don't cause any problems, but in synchronicity with each other, as they happen all in combination with each other, eventually add up to a complex system that causes a significant catastrophic issue, right? So the first thing is to realize that all human organizations, all humans tend to explain away weak signals because they've seen the weak signal before, and that weak signal didn't cause a problem in the past. The second one is time pressure. So as we kind of get time pressure, making time to think about alternate outcomes or to notice weak signals gets squeezed out, right? The pressure of like actually acting makes it harder for us to think. So this temporal compression means that we're thinking less and acting more. And the lack of thinking or the lack of imagining what might happen is another reason why we get stuck in previous frames. So we just don't have time to come up with new frames during either the approach of or the incidence of an event. The last one is attentional focus. So during an event, all our attention gets drawn into trying to stabilize the parts of the system that we believe need to be stable. We spend all of our time trying to stabilize those parts of the system. And the question ends up being things like, is this the most and best way to invest our attention right now, especially if we have significant systemic change? If we're in the middle of a significant systemic change, is stabilizing the system the right thing to be doing, or should we in fact be moving the system to try to get through the event? Like, what are the ways in which we can move the system forward as opposed to stabilize it or bring it back, right? So this is one of the kind of key things in resilience engineering to kind of think through, is that kind of resilience in mechanical engineering is about returning the system to previous function. And in resilience engineering in human systems, often it's not about returning to previous function, it's returning to adaptive capacity, right? In other words, can we get the system back to a state in which it can then address complexity again, as opposed to getting frozen and stuck? So it's not about returning it to previous function, as in like what it should be doing, but it's returning it to an ability to actually address change, right? So the differences there, I hope, are clear. So today we're going to talk about a couple things and some models that I have for thinking through this stuff. But one of the things that first kind of differentiate is the difference between potentials and options. And these are both future things, right, or imaginary things. They're not things that are present. They're things that could happen, right? And so a potential event is one that could happen, right? It's not happening. It could happen. And an option is an action that you could take. It's not one that you are taking, it's one that you could take. And one of the really interesting things about these is that because of the nature of their being in the future or being imaginary, there can be multiples of them, right? There's only one thing happening in theory right now, but there's many things that could happen, right? Same thing with options. There's only one thing that you have chosen to do and are acting on, but there are many potential things that you could do in the future, right? So there's this multiplicity effect that's very interesting. And people tend to get focused when they get that time compression on what is happening, what is happening right now, what action am I taking right now, and what they lose from that is this multiplicity, this opening effect that allows them to address or think about alternate options. So when we think about this, I like to think that there are 4 frames that people think about, right? So first, there are what we call speculations, and speculations are just saying, like, what could the world be like? Maybe my model in my head of the world isn't the way the world is like right now. Maybe it could be like other things or like other ways. Maybe that's the way, maybe my model's not the way the world is right now, or maybe in the future, my model won't be accurate anymore. So speculations are about thinking about what other models or ways to think about the world I could have. And then there's questions about what would I like the world to be like? And these are ethical questions. What ought the world be like? Not how it is, but how I would like it to be. What are my ethical inquiries about the world? I'd like the world to be more concerned about humans than money. I'd like the world to be more concerned about communities than individuals. These are ethical statements and ethical ways of thinking, right? So that's the second set of imaginaries. And then there's this idea that you have desires, things that you would like out of the world or things that would make the world more pleasurable. So what are your goals? I would like to be able to eat good food tonight. I would like to be able to hang out with my friends. These are my desires or my goals. And then there's planning. What are my options? How will I achieve those things in the world? So these are the 4 ideas. And the thing is that these 4 ideas of imaginaries, these 4 imaginings that we have of the future, interact with each other, right? So speculations, changing how we imagine the world might be, drives the need for new options, right? So if we imagine the world is different than it is, then we need to imagine new ways of achieving things in that world, right? New options for achieving those things. But those options should be judged by their ability to fulfill our desires, right? Like, so if we have a new future, we have new options in that new future, then we can filter the set of options by whether or not they achieve the desired effects we want. And then finally, we have this other thing, which is that the selection of options is constrained by our ethical concerns, right? So we don't just accept any potential option. We select options that are based on our ethical standards. So, for instance, should we just let everyone get infected with coronavirus? That's an ethical option, right? It's an option that has ethical implications. Most people, I would hope, would think that seems like a pretty bad option because of ethical standards that we hold about whether or not humans can be sacrificed or not. Yeah. So these are kind of examples of the interrelationship between these 4 ways of kind of thinking about the future or imagining the future. Yeah. One of the other important things to realize that, is one of the moments at which we become concerned about options is that this idea that if there's only a single option, right, if there's only one thing that we can imagine doing, then it's not an option anymore, it's a default decision. And the defaultness of this decision should make us be concerned, right? So we should always, when we notice we can't think of other options, that is the most important time to stop and try to get other people. We might have to start that option, but we need as quickly as possible to get people to go out there and think of other options, right? So if we can only think of one option, we're almost certainly in danger, and it's probably has to do with this mismatch of our mental model to what's happening in reality. So I summarize all of these ideas into this graphic. And what this graphic says is that there's before an event, during an event, and after an event, right? So an event in this case is the corona outbreak, right? And before the event of the outbreak, we had a set of options, yeah? And those options, there were more of them before the outbreak. And as the outbreak approached becoming more and more real, we had less and less options. And that's primarily driven by the fact that some options take longer amounts of time to execute on than other options, right? So as you get closer to an event horizon, you get less options, primarily because you don't have time to execute some of the options, yeah? So some of the options are automatically defaulted because you can't act on them anymore. The second thing that we get is that the cost of the options often goes up as we approach an event horizon, right? So what we get is this kind of double effect. The number of options goes down towards default decision making, and the cost of those default decisions goes up, right? So in the United States, we just passed a $2 trillion bill that is the result of not executing on options, and now we are in default situations where we have to stimulate our economy massively because we didn't act fast enough to suppress the virus early enough, right? So those are some examples of options being kind of constrained or compressed as the event horizon happens, and the cost of it going up. Now, other ones in the United States that are similar examples right now is New York asking for 40,000 ventilators. And every day that we don't make more ventilators, and the peak of the virus in New York is predicted to be 14 days from now, every day we don't act is going to make the cost of not choosing that option go up. And the cost is going to be measured in human lives, unfortunately. So that's the idea. Then there's in the event, right? So in the event, there's whole other ways of dealing with decision-making, with being creative, with thinking, right? Some of the same things that I talked about earlier, like not getting jammed, not getting stuck in a single model, all become important. But the final piece is stabilization. And one of the ways to think about this is that if the coronavirus radically changed or made you feel frustrated, made you feel like you didn't know what was happening, made you feel like you were confused, frustrated, all these ideas, then what you need to do eventually is reintegrate the new information that you couldn't process previously. You need to reintegrate it into your decision-making in the future. And this is really what stabilization means. Stabilization is to reintegrate the experiences you had during an event into a new kind of mental model of the way the world works so that you can kind of go on with your life afterwards, right? So as we think about this, what we're trying to do, this is an idea called the future cone. And the future cone basically says, I introduce it slightly differently than other people do. If you're interested in reading some of the original literature, I'd be happy to provide it. But the way I tend to describe this is that there is a set of probable things. And those probable things, right, are really simple. It just means what's probably going to happen. It's the way your mental model plays out in the future, right? Your mental model says this is probably going to happen, right? And then around that are things that are plausible that could happen. So things that are within your current mental model that you can imagine happening, but you don't think will probably happen. You could think of them happening, but they probably won't happen. And then there's things that can possibly happen. And the important criteria here between kind of plausible and possible is that things that can possibly happen may not be imaginable by you. Like there's plenty of possibilities in the world that humans can't explain or can't understand, right? So there's a radical kind of cliff here between plausibility and possibility. And then the final one is this idea that we want to shift towards preferable outcomes versus probable outcomes. So the way that designing works, or the way that decision-making works, is shifting the trajectory from what is probable and undesirable to what is preferable and desirable, right? So it's a way of shifting. So part of this discussion is about understanding the way in which our current models make us believe certain things will happen the way in which our mental models make some things more or less plausible, like that could happen, and the differences between those. Because really, in a social system, one of the really important criteria for awareness is not just becoming aware of it, but being able to communicate about what we've become aware of, right? So in other words, it's great if I know something's going to happen, but if I can't explain that thing to Ben quickly, it doesn't matter that I know that it happens, because we're in a social unit that needs to respond as a social unit. So part of the activity of awareness is to actually, anticipatory awareness is to actually have some of these storytelling conversations prior to needing to explain the event itself. So if you notice it, you've kind of had a little bit of practice talking about it already. Ben.
Does anybody know what this is?
It's a glitter bomb.
A glitter bomb. Yes. Does anyone know how to make a glitter bomb? Has anyone ever made a glitter bomb before?
Unfortunately not.
Okay. Well, so here's the interesting question, right? How might you make a glitter bomb?
The important thing is to make it something that does not look like a glitter bomb.
So it has to not look like a glitter bomb. What is a glitter bomb made of? How would you make one? So we got a wrapper that needs to obscure
a distribution agent and glitter. In the image, it's a spring with a spring under a thing, but there were others that are motorized. So
got it. So there's a spring, there's a platform that the glitter kind of sits on, and then when you open it, it explodes. How might you recognize if someone has sent you a glitter bomb? How would you prevent, I would say, how would you notice the moment before this glitter bomb explodes so you know not to open it?
That they're trying their hardest not to burst out laughing.
That's a great one.
Strange.
What else? Like, how might you, like, what if they're not in the room? How might you, so when Manish says unusual thing in your usual environment. Yeah, so unusual. Yeah. How else might you notice that it's a glitter bomb?
If the package is too light for what it claims to be.
Oh, yeah. I like that one, yeah.
That's excellent. That's really good. Yeah.
If it rattles in a weird way.
Yeah. These are all...
That spring noise.
If you haven't received one for a long time.
Yeah, and Aribo says maybe heavier on one side or makes weird sounds. This is exactly right. And so what we've just described is kind of a way of getting glitter bombed, taking it from being possible into making it plausible. Like we've just recognized how to sense that we might be about to be glitter bombed. And so by doing so, we've sensitized ourselves in a way that I'm afraid we can't undo. You all are now imbued with the gift of being able to notice strange containers that might be glitter bombs now, which is great because you can get one for $9.99 and send it to someone, and we're not sure if it's illegal or not, but it's cheap. So keep an eye out there. Yeah, so Jabe, I'll turn it back to you here.
So what we're talking about here, just to differentiate one more time, for those of you who do Wardley-ish things, Wardley likes to talk about situational awareness. And one of the things I like to say is that situational awareness is in the situation, right? And situations don't have to last for like short periods of time. They can last for long periods of time. But anticipatory awareness is different in that it is trying to imagine other situations, not imagine what is currently happening, right? So situational awareness is specific in my language to what's happening in the event. And so increasing our awareness of what is happening is situational awareness. Increasing our awareness of what might happen is anticipatory awareness. So that's where we're focused. And in this case, we want to say that what allows us to do that is storytelling versus map making. Yeah, I think you could make maps out of stories, and that would be fun and interesting. And Ben and I do something called ecological explorations to do those things, and we have a whole set of work that we like to do around that. But what we want you guys to focus on today is this storytelling aspect of it. The kind of key takeaways before I let you guys go off and do this exercise is that really during approaching and during a crisis or an event, the most scarce resource is often not information, right? So I don't know. I don't know about the rest of you. I'm a little bit obsessive compulsive about certain things. And so I find myself constantly trying to ingest as much information as possible right now. But that's actually not a good or useful thing to be doing, right? Because the question is, what information should I be paying attention to in order to actually improve things, not just how can I ingest more information, right? So literally attention, what to pay attention to is critical. And one of the things that we're trying to do with anticipatory awareness is increase the number of things that you might pay attention to so that you're scanning broader as opposed to deeper. Dave Snowden talks about the way to modulate this as being this idea that you're kind of the example he uses, which is the one I like to use as well, is this idea like when you're driving, have you ever like been driving for a long way, like maybe a couple hours, and you kind of wake up and realize that you've been driving for a long time, but you don't actually remember driving, right? Like you have this automaticity that happens to your body and your mind where certain things are just kind of rote enough that you don't have to be thinking while doing it. So there's this lots and lots of work that we do are like this, right? But sometimes there's small signals that can actually increase our awareness of things. There's interesting studies about this that say that people who are race car drivers, if you do analysis of where their eyes are significantly, pay attention to significantly different things than normal drivers. And what they pay attention to is places in which there's likely to be an accident next. So literally, human drivers, normal drivers, look straight at the road in front of them and the lines, the edge of the road, and just pay attention to staying on the road. Race car drivers are constantly scanning to see where the accident's going to happen next based on a lot of experience of where they almost gotten into an accident in the past, right? So they are very aware of potential accidents as opposed to actual accidents, yeah? So management of attention is really what we're trying to get people to think about here. And I think, you know, kind of in the vein of trying to do this in a time of crisis, part of management of attention is also management of our anxiety, of our sensations of being not in control by actually trying to decide, okay, what should I be paying attention to? And one of the interesting things that happens with kind of the trigger work that we'll do is that if you can imagine a possibility, but you can imagine a set of triggers that would make that possibility be likely to be actualized, you can actually kind of put it away from yourself a little bit because you don't have to worry about it until you actually see the trigger occur. So it's like a way of compartmentalizing off certain futures. You imagine them, you allow yourself to think through them, but then you say, okay, that could happen, but what would need to be true in order for that to happen? And if those things haven't happened yet, I don't have to worry about it as if it's something I need to address right this moment. I just need to kind of list it in my things that I'm kind of scanning quickly so that I can know whether or not this potentiality is likely or not.
What we're going to do next is a little bit of story writing. The idea is by telling these stories, by imagining stories, we can talk about the possibilities, kind of like the glitter bomb again, in a way that enables us to be sensitized to how they might start. And that way we can stop being anxious about them for the moment. But when they start to happen, we can kick into gear and kick into action. So what we'll do is we'll start with talking about some characters that might appear in our stories. Let's take 30 seconds or so. Add characters that you can think of. Like who are characters in the stories we might tell about this COVID-19 scenario, for example? Like I'm thinking of the CDC, the WHO. I'm thinking of the people who work at my grocery store. I'm thinking of the people that I work with all the time. I'm thinking about my immunocompromised friends, right? All these people are potential characters. And what we're going to do next is we're going to each break out into groups and we're going to fill out something that I'm calling the reverse story canvas. And the reverse story canvas is basically 6 sections that you step through in order. And it's kind of like you learn to tell a story in reverse. You start with who might be in the story, and then you talk about the ending. How does this story end? What potential outcome are you really like scared of most? What happens to your characters? And then you ask yourself, what happens right before that? What happens in the middle of the story? And then what happens before that? What happens at the beginning of the story? And so you kind of write the story in reverse together as a group. And then you look at the story and you ask yourself, what are the triggers I would want to watch for if this story was about to begin? What kind of weak signals would I have to monitor? And I'll kind of like share a quick example here. There's an example that I like to use from a friend of mine who works at a grocery store. We'll call her Jennifer. And so she's a grocery store employee, and what she's worried about is an ending where she can't get gasoline because there's a gasoline shortage, she can't get to work, and she can't pay rent. Like the real outcome she's afraid of is not being able to pay rent. That is a terrifying outcome. So right beforehand, she might expect sort of supply chains to break down. Like so it's hard to get gas into the city, and that's because the city is quarantined. And before that, there's an uncontrolled outbreak in the city that she's in. Well, how does this whole thing begin, right? Well, it starts when the healthcare system is overwhelmed to the point of failure because the government response was too late. And kind of the way it all began was Jennifer started seeing COVID-19 cases appear in her city. And so then we can have this discussion about what signals could Jennifer monitor to tell that this story has begun. Like she doesn't need to go like think every day, oh no, am I going to be able to pay rent? She needs to just be paying attention to the signals. So what signals might she monitor? Well, nearby her grocery store is a hospital. One way she could tell if this story was starting was, does the nearby hospital appear disorderly from the outside? Does it seem in control just by like driving by and looking? If so, then maybe there's nothing to be worried about. But if things start to change in that way, then maybe there is something to be concerned about. And so this is a way of us becoming sensitized to the story. And then of course, the 6th step is just give the story a title. You know, every story needs a good title. And as a group, you'll need to choose a storyteller because we're going to come together and share our stories. Take about 10 minutes to fill out the story canvas together, and then we'll come back together as a whole group and tell some stories. So yeah, let's start telling some stories. And because we're running low on time, do any of the storytellers need to leave really soon? Yeah, let's do Dragon and then Jan.
Yeah, we've been discussing terrorists, maybe terrorists from a rogue nation. What we would see then is that as soon as the world would think that the pandemic is over, then the terrorists would threaten with another restart of the pandemic. One of the first signals that we might see is that there is some unexplainable differences in the spreading of the virus between some countries. And maybe, for instance, that could be between North Korea and South Korea, for instance, which might be the first indicators that, well, somebody is actually pulling some strings related to the virus.
Unexplained spread as a trigger. That's a really interesting one.
Yeah.
Who would like to go next? What's your story and what were the triggers?
Our story is it's called Locked Up, Lockdown. And we have 2 characters, Anthony and David. They're on holiday in another country when this virus thing starts. And they notice that people are saying lockdown more and more often. And people are saying that the lockdown is going to happen in a week or 2 weeks. But before they know it,
6 p.m.
The lockdown happens in the next day. And this causes a problem for them because they need to get medication, life-saving medication. So because they needed this so badly, they had to defy the lockdown and they went looking for it in the streets. Then they were caught by the police, who now put them in jail, and they wound up being in prison. So they wound up being locked up because of a lockdown. And that's the story.
That's a great story. What are the sort of triggers that might tell you that this story is starting?
Yeah, we said that people are underestimating how bad things are. That people are saying it's very good, it won't last long. There's a lot of soothing, reassuring talk when what you observe is things getting worse. You observe things getting worse, but politicians are saying things are going to get better.
Awesome. Thank you for sharing.
With no reference to Trump.
I admire your restraint. Who else would like to tell a story?
I can go. The title of the story is The Importance of a Safety Net. And the main characters in this are folks with insecure incomes. The triggers that they see is that the industry they're in starts to suffer and that other companies start firing employees. They see fewer and fewer people out on the streets, shopping and so forth. So they start then seeing the spread of the coronavirus. Their employer lays them off because the employer doesn't provide job security, either intentionally or unintentionally. This results in them losing their jobs. They get sick. They try to find support, but they can't because they can't afford it. And they come into contact with someone with the virus. This ends up with them losing their homes and ultimately dying.
Nobody said the endings had to be happy. Thanks, Mark.
Can I make a comment on the last story?
Sure.
There's a philosopher named Alan Badiou, and he talks about this idea. It's called the event. And in his version of the event, it's interesting version of yours, because what happens, he says, is that the dominant view of what is happening, right? The dominant view of the current narrative is enforced by power, right? So in other words, there's some power structure that's saying this is what's happening, right? So you could say that's the media, or it's, in the United States, it's Donald Trump talking on television every day, and he's trying to portray a certain thing that's happening, right? And the interesting thing about your story is that in Badiou's ideas, there's also like a ground level experience of what's happening. So there's people who are about to lose their homes, etc. They have experiences that don't align with the primary dominant narrative, right? And so the event, or the revolutionary moment, is another way of kind of thinking about this, is when the power structure can no longer maintain its narrative in relation to what's actually being experienced in the ground. And it causes a sudden catastrophic collapse of the primary narrative, which is problematic because, on one hand, power loses its narrative. It loses its ability to say what's happening and therefore control things. But also it means that the thing that binds the social structure together, which is the dominant narrative, also collapses at the same time. And so you get a revolution, and in that revolutionary moment, people who are experiencing what's really happening all of a sudden suddenly pop to the surface and get seen, right? They get their experience of the world becomes the new dominant experience, and then they have to kind of be rethought or understood. And so the event is caused by this kind of drift apart of the dominant narrative from what's really being experienced. And the other story that I was involved in listening to was a similar one that was kind of talking about how healthcare workers are experiencing the viral experience versus the dominant narrative, right? And how they may how the dominant narrative may unintentionally be causing healthcare workers to become more at risk because they may be being portrayed as being someone who should be prejudiced against, right? Like that you should be scared of the healthcare worker, or that they might be diseased already, all these kind of ideas. So this idea of the event, I think, is really interesting to play with. And it's this idea of the difference between power's narrative and the actual experience that's happening on the ground. And during sudden kind of cataclysmic or significant shearing of reality like the virus is causing, the experience of day-to-day life, everyday life, people's lives, is often at odds with what power is portraying. So that's an interesting thing to notice at a meta level and talk about or think about how that's going to occur. And you could use it just in your day-to-day at work experience too, like what the executive thinks happening versus what the people on the ground thinks happening. And it's always going to be different, but if it gets too far apart, then you have real sudden issues are more likely to occur.
Yeah, I saw a video the other day of a healthcare worker in Australia, and she was just saying that a patient who was presumed to be COVID positive spat in her face because, quote unquote, she was going to get it anyway.
Yep, exactly. Or is that, or like, the difference between healthcare workers, and I don't think it's just going to be healthcare workers. Like Ben, we've talked about, like people who work at grocery stores, people who are all of these people are both are taking like a risk and a meta risk. The risk is they might get the virus. The meta risk is that they might be perceived as viral carriers because they took the risk in the first place. And so then those people all of a sudden, the fear is that those people will be removed from their homes, that people in their apartment buildings will be like, you can't come back here, or that they will be afraid to go home to their families because they're afraid that they're a carrier. And then the question ends up being like, so for all these people who we can't prove are or are not infected, are or are not carriers, and since we don't have a way of doing kind of an antipathogen, like a way of knowing whether or not you have developed resistance or not, all these people who are walking around are at risk. I don't think the fear level is actually where it will be. When 10,000 people a day die in New York City, people are going to be a lot more scared than they are right now. And what happens to all those care providers who are exposing themselves and taking risks, not just as individuals, but as a social group? How will we handle them, and what are the things that we need to do right now to help people not kind of create prejudice against them, and or to create housing and support for this class of worker that is critical for providing healthcare and food, but maybe going to be highly prejudiced against. So I thought it was a really interesting conversation.